everyone. I've been living in the shadows of YouTube for a while now, and today I am going to be trying my hand at a format that I've been interested in for quite a lot of 2021 and 2022. That is educational ASMR. And to give myself the best start, I'd like to talk about something that I love. And I love the L. The L is the metro system for Chicago. Chicago is the largest city in the state of Illinois in the United States. And the L is the main way that people get around on public transit. Obviously, there is a bus system and there are commuter rail lines, but um, the L, which is short for elevated, is the main train system for getting around the entire city. It's one of the oldest metro systems in the world. It's actually the second oldest if you count just in terms of when different metro systems were electrified. But it still tries to feel modern and modernize itself where it can. The city takes a lot of pride in it. And when I lived in the city for the time, I had the pleasure of using it. Now, here we have a map of the entire system. It's a poster made by a company, not by the CTA, which is the agency that runs the L. So it is missing a little bit of information that the normal CTA maps have, but it has pretty much everything. And I've laid it on its side because my desk is not long enough for us to fit everything. But we're making do. It is quite a large poster, I will say, and I think that's a good thing, but it also makes it hard to make a video like this. Now we're going to start in the part of the system that I think most people who are familiar with the L, who aren't from Chicago, are most familiar with, and that is this center area. It's called the Loop. If we move the map further up, we can see in this section here, we have the Loop. It is a loop, obviously, of track, elevated track that goes along 4 of the main streets of downtown Chicago. It goes down Wells, Van Buren, Wabash, and Lake Streets. And it contains 5 out of the 8 lines of the network. Within the loop, there is also the Red Line, which is in the State Street subway. And there's the Blue Line, which is in the Dearborn Street subway, as well as subways on other streets. Like I said, this is the part of the L system that people are most familiar with, because if you're in downtown Chicago, it is an easy way to get around, and it is also an easy way to get from downtown to the rest of the network. see from the general map that the L system is centered right in downtown. And it spreads out like a spider, almost. That's how I like to think about it, throughout the city. You can tell there are 8 lines, 6 rainbow colors: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, and purple, as well as the brown line and the pink line. And to go over the history of the system, we start, I suppose technically, it is within the loop, but not within the modern loop as we think of it today. It's really starting from the Congress Terminal, which is right around where the Harold Washington Library station now is. Now the Congress Terminal no longer exists. But it started from here, and it went along this length of track to 39th Avenue, which we now know today as Pershing Road. This was in 1892. At the time, it was called the South Side Elevated Railroad. That station has since closed. It closed in 1949. But later in 1892, the line extended all the way to 55th, which is now Garfield. And then in 1893, we saw extensions down to 61st, and then to Dorchester, then finally to Jackson Park, which was what the original L, this original stretch of track, was built for, was to get people from downtown Chicago, or from all around the city, originating, getting down to downtown Chicago, and from there to Jackson Park for the Columbian Exposition, which is also known as the 1893 World's Fair. Now, once that fair ended, the line got brought back from Jackson Park to Stony Island, and with various closures, both to the end of the line, but also to stations early up on the line, and brought the terminus down to Cottage Grove, where it is today. The other remaining branch of the South Side portion of the Green Line is the Englewood branch. It inched its way along its current route as a branch off of the main, what was considered the main route of the line, starting with State and Wentworth in 1905, a number of more stations in 1906, and then finally to Racine and Loomis right around here in 1907. Not much remains. There were stations all along this stretch, but only 2 of them remain: Halsted and Ashland and 63rd, which was the replacement for the old Loomis station. These are the 2 branches of the Southside Elevated that exist today. but quite a number used to exist. First, there was the Normal Park branch, which extended from Harvard Station down to 69th Street along Stewart Avenue. And farther north, at Indiana Station, where this poster doesn't do a really good job of showing, but the line jogs, there were two other branches. There was the Kenwood branch, which went all the way to 42nd and Oakenwald, just past Lake Park Avenue. To the west, there was the Stockyards branch, which ran a loop around the Union Stockyards, which at one time were Chicago's central meatpacking and processing district. All three of these old branches existed from the late 1900s, when the Englewood branch was born, to the 1950s. The next oldest part of the network is actually the north side of the Green Line. I'll move my map up so we can see it. Actually, first, before we get to that part of the Green Line, we have to talk about the middle part of the Green Line, here at the loop along Wabash and Lake Streets, which came into being in 1895. They came into being because of this extension here. I really shouldn't say extension. These, at the time, were independent companies creating independent lines. And this was the Lake Street Elevated, because it ran along Lake Street, starting in 1893 from Madison and Market, which is another closed terminal, first going all the way to California, and then extending to Laramie, which at the time was called 52nd Avenue, and it was the city limits of Chicago at the time. Eventually, the township that bordered Chicago at the time ceded some of its land and also gave the city of Chicago building rights to build all the way to Forest Park. Although now it's inched back to Harlem and Lake as of 1962. Our next section is the two related lines of the blue and the pink. They were the third company to join the scene of independent rail companies. They were called the Metropolitan West Side Elevated Railway. Throughout 1895, the Metropolitan lines extended from a terminal at Franklin and Van Buren, which we can't really well see because, again, the loop only shows the main 6 streets, but along Van Buren. Then out all the way to Cicero, or 48th Avenue, due west on what is called the Garfield Park branch. To Logan Square on the Northwest branch. And to Lawndale along Damon Avenue on the Humboldt Park branch. Oh, wait, sorry. My apologies. This Humboldt Park branch, which obviously no longer exists, it closed in 1952. These northern branches did not originally come to downtown on the diagonal that the Blue Line has now. They originally turned south at Division, and they run parallel to Paulina Avenue until they got back to the Garfield Park branch, this horizontal, well, roughly horizontal Blue Line branch. And now the actual history of the Pink Line. The Douglas Park branch started the next year, starting from this same intersection, following Paulina to then 21st, starting at Western, moving to sorry, I'm forgetting a little bit of my history. Continuing chronologically, we next have the extensions from Cicero to Laramie, and then Douglas from Western all the way to Pulaski. In 1905, the Forest Park branch got all the way to Forest Park, although at that time it was called Des Plaines Station. And this more or less covers the route of what is now the Blue Line, although in 1958 this was rerouted by a couple of blocks so that the Eisenhower Expressway, or I-290, was built so that the Blue Line could go in the middle of the expressway. The same thing happened in 1970 when the Northwestern branch, which we followed in Logan Square, went to Jefferson Park. This section from Addison to Jefferson Park runs down the center of the Kennedy Expressway, one of the many names for the union of Interstates 90 and 94. And at that time, Logan Square went from being an above-ground station to a below-ground station, to be below ground at Belmont and to be in the middle of the freeway at Addison and beyond. Let's finish this portion of the line off. We're at Jefferson Park in 1970, then to Rosemont in 1983, and to O'Hare International Airport in 1984. Other than downtown, O'Hare is probably the most famous part of the L. Mostly because people are flying into the city from who knows where, domestically, internationally. And this is the route they take to go to downtown. It's quite a lovely station. It's got a lot of glass and rainbow effects among the lights, the glass. Now, before I interrupted myself with the rest of the Blue Line, let's give the Douglas branch, now the Pink Line, last few updates. By 1902, we were at Pulaski. 1907, we reached Cicero. By 1910, we had reached Laramie. And by 1924, we went all the way to Oak Park. Although in 1952 was when we saw the terminus inch back to what is now the terminus at 54th and Cermak. There also used to be an extension from Forest Park out to Winchester, farther out into the suburbs, but that only lasted until 1951. And now let's get on to our last new network, our last new company to add something to the network. First was the South Side, then the Lake Street, then Metropolitan West Side, and lastly, the Northwestern Elevated. Originally, like all the other lines, it started downtown. And it wound its way largely on the same route that the Brown and the Purple Express lines take today, all the way to Wilson in 1900. It then made a very large extension past much of the north side, as far as Central Street in Evanston in 1908, and lastly to the current terminus met at Linden Avenue in 1912. This is the farthest north that the L system has ever gone, and based on current politics, likely ever will, but it is a good long line. Now, not all of the stations that make up this part of the line were on the original line. Lawrence, Berwyn, Thorndale, and Foster. Forgot where I was. They all came after, and many stations changed their names after 1912, which is true for a lot of places on the network. Now, this service pattern that we see here, where we have local service to all of the stations from Belmont to Howard, and terminating at Howard, started in 1949. At the same time, we got the shuttle service, which has more stations now at Wellington and Diversey, and also Armitage. But it skips Addison and Sheridan, and skips all the local stops to Howard before going on to Evanston and Wilmot. Meanwhile, we get the Ravenswood branch, the Brown Line, which was built in 1907 and pretty much follows the same route that it did when it was built. What was once Roby Station is now Damon, which is true for the other Damon stations. And there also used to be a Ravenswood station at this curve. There is also now an overpass for trains going onto this branch from the south going north. That was completed in 2021. But otherwise, this branch remains the same. And last bit of track is the black sheep, or I should say the yellow sheep of the network, the yellow line, also called the Skokie Swift, which was the original name for the service, and it still sometimes gets called that because, to honor that name, and because of the rocket logo that I don't believe is actually preserved. No, it's not. It's not preserved on this poster. Oh well. It used to have more stops from its trek from Howard to Dempster Skokie, specifically at Ridge, Asbury, Dodge, Crawford, Costner, and Maine. That was during the original run from 1925 to 1948. When they revitalized the service in 1964, it originally just ran as a shuttle from Howard to Dempster. But they added Oakton Station, Oakton Skokie Station, really, in 2012. And so now the line has 3 stations. If we continue sequentially, as we have been for the most part, we get the subway. These are the first real times when the system that was entirely above ground up to this point went underground. Obviously, we talked about the subway stations at Logan Square and Belmont back when the Kennedy Expressway was being developed. But we also, before then, got the downtown subway on what is now the Red Line, going from Willow Street just south of Armitage, following its current route north in Clybourne, Clarkman Division, then following State Street, Chicago Grand, this portion of the loop, down to Roosevelt. The fun thing about this section from Lake to Monroe to Jackson is that this is the world's longest subway platform, because these stations are all on one continuous platform underneath State Street. The other subway on Dearborn and eventually on Milwaukee Avenues, Grand, Chicago, and Division here, came into being later in 1951. In the same year, we got the founding of this company, the icon that's known throughout the city, Chicago Transit Authority. the CTA. This was not the first time that all of the companies that created the L were unified under one company. That originally happened in 1924 with the Chicago Rapid Transit Company. But the CTA brought that better into fruition, along with some ideas of ways to improve service and improve the budget, and it fulfills the service of running and maintaining the L to this day. And now we're getting back to the history. We get to the final stretches of track. We have, in 1969, the continuation of the subway to Roosevelt down on the Dan Ryan branch, which is the namesake for the 95th Dan Ryan station, but also for the freeway, again, mostly Interstates 90 and 94, although from this section down, it is strictly Interstate 94. And like the Kennedy section that we discussed earlier, that came in the year after, in 1970, this runs down the median of the freeway. Now, Chicago loves naming its highways, as you can tell from talking about the Eisenhower, obviously. Dwight D. Eisenhower, the President of the U.S., John F. Kennedy Highway, and the Dan Ryan Highway, which obviously is not a U.S. president, but was a influential president for the Cook County Board of Commissioners. Cook County is the county that oversees Chicago, as well as a number of the innermost suburbs. And here is where we're likely going to see the next extension of the network. The CTA has planned to extend the line all the way to 130th, which obviously isn't on our map, so I can't point to it. But it is impressive, especially given how relatively little there is in terms of rail infrastructure on the south side. And it would also put the CTA at just 8 avenues away from the southernmost street in Chicago, which is 138th. And now we have our last new set of track, which was built in 1993 and was built in one fell swoop to connect from Roosevelt, or really from Loop, but extending from Roosevelt down along the southwest side to Midway Airport, which was the original major airport for Chicago before O'Hare was built. It's an airport that primarily serves Southwest Airlines, and it was built in 1983. And this might have been called the Midway branch back when it was first opened. I've called a lot of these branches by different names: Dan Ryan, Englewood, Ravenswood, Douglas Park, Forest Park, Northwest. This was never called the Midway branch because all of these branch names came about before the color system that we know and love today. The Orange Line came about in the same day, in 1993, that the CTA adopted a color scheme for all the lines, assigning these to blue, and this to brown, and this to red, and this to purple. And this to green, and this to red, which was also a major change because before 1993, the service that started as the Northwest Elevated from Howard went south to Englewood and to Cottage Grove. And the service that went along the Lake Street Elevated went down to 95th. And so in 1983, those services switched on the same day that the color system came into effect. And it still is there to this day, although sometimes you will see red line trains that may, on occasion, switch to be green line trains. And the infrastructure, obviously, still exists to allow trains to become one or the other, coming from the subway or coming from the loop, to do either. Now, despite colors being introduced in 1993, orange was not the last color to be introduced, but pink. Because up until 2005, the Douglas branch was still running under its old northwest and west side service pattern. And that changed in 2005. So the old Paulina Avenue connector from the Eisenhower to the Green Line was reopened. And this new service, which became known as the Pink Line, switched to going onto the Paulina connector and then joining the Green Line in Ashland and doing a full loop. And that really is the history of the L in basic terms. Obviously, I've skipped over a large number of stations opening, stations closing, stations changing names. But I hope this has given you a good idea of what has gone on in the past 130 years of this system. 131, really. And the next time that you're in Chicago, I hope you consider the L as your way of getting to the sights of Chicago, whether that be shopping along State Street or visiting plays on the north side of the loop, or going to Navy Pier, or along the lake shore of Lake Michigan, or going to the museum campus, Adler Planetarium, the Field Museum, going out to the United Center, to the Garfield Park Observatory, to Hyde Park to visit the University of Chicago and the Roby House of Frank Lloyd Wright's, to go out to Oak Park and to visit the old homes and studios of Frank Lloyd Wright and Ernest Hemingway. Visit the up-and-coming neighborhoods of Bucktown, Wicker Park, Logan Square, Hermosa. Visit Wrigley Field for baseball at Addison, or Guaranteed Rate Field, what used to be Comiskey Park for the Sox at Sox 35th. Or go down Brewery Row along Ravenswood on the Brown Line. Or to Loyola University, which is now mostly famous for making it to the Final Four in March Madness. Or going to Northwestern University, a very prestigious private college. Or going to the Baha'i House, a very large temple, center of worship for the Baha'i faith in North America, just off of London. And I realize this is where Northwestern is. I did not have it in view of my camera. So hopefully, next time you're in Chicago, you think about taking a ride on the L. Thank you all for watching, and I hope to make more videos like this. Take care, everyone. Bye.